Now that you know all about higher order components, it's time to actually use React Redux to connect the two together. First up, I am going to shut down the higher order component file, and over inside of the Webpack config file, I am going to switch us back to running app.js in the source directory. I'm then going to shut down that file and restart the development server so we can actually view the Expensify application over inside of the browser. If we are seeing the app, then we are ready to actually get some stuff done. And goal one is just going to be to list the expenses on the dashboard page. So this is where we're going to have that big table of expenses where we can view everything, we can sort and filter them, and we actually do have some expenses already in this store. So the question is, how do we get access to the store information from our React components? Now, there really is no good way to get this done, and that's the reason we started using something like Redux in the first place. Remember, we no longer have that clear tree structure to pass stuff between. If we did, we might be able to take the store and just pass it down into all of our components, going deep and deep to every component that needs it. But even if we could do that, it would still be a bad idea, because remember, once again, we're passing a ton of props between components when they're not actually using them, and that's going to create a situation where our components really aren't reusable. So what we're going to do instead is install the React Redux library, and I do want to show you where that lives on the web. If you Google React-Redux, you're going to be able to find the GitHub repository, and the library itself is actually very small. It does not provide a whole lot of stuff. There are basically two things we need from it. There's a single component and a single function. So down below, we can get a high-level overview of what we're going to get. Right here, we get a provider component and we get a connect function. We're going to be using the provider component once at the root of our application, and we're going to be using connect for every single component that needs to connect to the Redux store. So let's go ahead and install this library and see how this actually plays out in the real world. I am going to head over to the terminal, shut down the dev server, and use yarn add to add React-Redux, and I am going to go ahead and add the latest version, that is 5.0.5. I'm going to go ahead and actually run the command, adding that library in, and once it's added, we'll just start up the development server once again and start importing some stuff off of the library. I'm going to boot up that dev server, switch back over to Chrome, back into the editor, and what we're going to do right here is take advantage of that provider component. So the first step is to import it up above. We get access to both of these things, provider and connect, as named exports. For this file, I just need to import the named export provider, uppercase P, since it is a React component, and I'm going to grab that from right here, React-Redux. Now the provider component is very simple to use. What we're going to do down below is tweak what we render to the screen. To get that done, I am going to take the app router instance and cut it out, replacing it with a JSX variable that we'll create right now. So const JSX equals, in here, we'll just dump the JSX. So we haven't changed the functionality at all. We've just broken things out into a separate variable, and that's going to make it a little easier to see what we're about to do. The application still works, so now let's go ahead and actually use the provider component. So provider is going to allow us to provide the store to all of the components that make up our application. And this is a super useful feature. It means that we do not need to manually pass the store around. Instead, individual components that want to access the store can just access it. So using provider isn't bad. The API is pretty simple. There's not a whole lot to it. Right here, we're going to go ahead and open and close a provider tag. And I'm opening and closing a tag because we do have to provide something inside. This is the rest of our application. So for us, that just means, once again, rendering an instance of app router. There's also a single prop that we have to pass into provider. This is the store that we're trying to share with the rest of our application. So the prop name is store, and you have to set it equal to your Redux store. In my case, I have that in a variable with the same name. So right here, I will just reference the store variable. And that is all it takes to set up provider. If I go ahead and save app.js, we're not going to get any fancy data rendering to the app just yet, but we're also not getting any errors. Our application is still working. I'm able to traverse the various pages without running into any issues. What we have now, though, is an application where all of the components do have access to the store, which means that we can take advantage of the other thing that React Redux gives us, which was that connect function. We can't use connect without having provider set up, but provider is set up. So we're now ready to actually create components that grab information from the store. For now, let's focus on just getting the basic expenses list rendered. Inside of components, we have some of our page components. I'm going to create one new one for the expenses list right here. We can call that one expense list.js. And this is where we're going to create a stateless functional component. So I will import React. From React, then we can create the component const expense list, setting it equal to, and right here, we're going to go ahead and set up the stateless functional component. So we'll have some props that get passed in. We'll talk about those a bit later. We're going to have the body of our component, and there is actually no need for the body. We can just get right to rendering stuff to the screen. So I will open and close some parentheses. Then we're going to go ahead and render what we want to render. For the moment, let's just render a div. And in the div, we'll put some text that makes this easy to identify on the screen. Expense list, and maybe we toss that in an H1 tag. Perfect. So once we have this in place, we can actually go ahead and render this. Nothing earth-shattering there. So I can set up an export default expense list, and now I can import this from some other file and actually get it rendered to the screen. The only place we're going to put the expense list is on the expense dashboard for now. So I'll crack open that component and we'll start getting some meaningful stuff rendered to the screen here. Step one is to just import the component. I'm going to import expense list, the default export I just set up from a local file. // in the current directory right here, we have the expense list file. Now, if I save the expense dashboard page, nothing's going to change because we're not using expense list. So right here, instead of having some dummy text, we're going to move on to having real meaningful stuff. I'm going to render expense list to the screen. Now, if we save the expense dashboard page, the end result is that our expense list does show up, but we're not yet seeing any information. We do have the ability to use connect to pull data off, but we haven't done that yet. So let's kick things off by actually importing the named export connect. It's called connect because it connects your component to the Redux store. Right here, we're going to grab that from the React Redux library. So we're going to be using the connect function in all of our individual components. So for things like expense list and others that need to either dispatch actions or read from the store, for now, we're just going to focus on reading from the store. We have two items that are getting added to the list. Let's go ahead and try to get those two items showing up. Step one down below is going to be creating a new const for the higher order component. So for connected components, I'm usually just going to put the word connected in front of the component name. So instead of expense list, this would be the connected expense list. And that makes it easy to differentiate between the two. Now we're going to set this equal to, and right here, we're going to call connect, similar to how we called the functions in the previous video, where we created our own higher order components. Now this API is slightly different. Right here, we get something back. And what we get back is not the higher order component. It's actually the function, kind of like the functions we created in the previous video, which means we need to call that with the component. So right here, I'm going to pass in expense list. Could they have set it up to have the component passed in here? Sure, but that's not the API we have. We have to use their API, so this is exactly what we're going to be using. Now, what happens here? Why even have this argument at all? Well, right here, this is where we provide the information about what we want to connect. So we have a ton of information on the store. Does the component need all of it? No, it usually just needs a subset. So what we do here is we define a function. This function lets us determine what information from the store we want our component to be able to access. And the store's state actually gets passed in right here as the first argument. Now, how does this function work? Well, we just return an object. On this object, we can put any key value pairs we like. Usually, they're going to be things from the state, but I could even just set up name to have the string value Andrew. Now, the connected expense list component is going to have access to the name prop, which means that up above, I can set up props and I can use the value. So I'm going to set up props and I'm going to use it right here, props.name. Now at this point, we might as well have not even created this because we're not using it at all. So what we're going to do is set that up as the default export instead of this one. Right here, we are going to export by default connected expense list. Now if we go ahead and save the file, we're actually going to be rendering the connected expense list. It is going to set name equal to the string Andrew, and we should see that showing up. If I refresh the page, that is exactly what we get. Now we can go from a useless thing like this to something much more meaningful by simply reading off of the state. So we know we have state dot expenses, for example, and we also have state dot filters. We just set those up. I'm going to read off state dot expenses, and I am going to pass that down to expense list via the expenses prop. So now our component has access to information from the store. We can go ahead and actually use it right here. I can use props dot expenses, and for the moment we can just use dot length to print the length of the expenses array. If I save the file, we should see 2 showing up, and that is exactly what we get. So there we have it. We've just connected our first React component to the Redux store. This is a fantastic first step, and we're going to move further with that, but I do want to make just a couple quick tweaks to the file. First up, it's usually not a common pattern to create a separate variable and then export it by default. I just did that so we can see explicitly how things are working. It's a much more common pattern that we're going to be using and that you're going to see in other folks' code bases to just use export default right here without creating a separate variable for the connected component. So this is a pattern you're going to be seeing quite a bit. It's also a very common practice to take this function and break it out into its own variable. So we can do that as well. Right here, a const, and this one is called map state to props because it is a function that maps the store state to component props. I'm going to set this up to equal exactly what we have right here. I'm going to take the function, cut it out, paste it right there, toss a semicolon on, and then just reference the variable map state to props. So if you look at real code bases that are using React and Redux, this is exactly what you're going to see. We're going to see our regular unconnected component. We're going to see some functions, map state to props being the only one we know about for the moment. And then you're going to see a call to connect at the very bottom that actually pulls all of this together. And the end result is that our component can access whatever data it needs from the store. Now, if we needed more information, we could grab everything we want. So let's say we also want to access the filters. I could set this up to have a filters prop, and I could get those from state.filters. Then I can use any of the filters I need in the expenses list component. For now, let's just go ahead and dump the sort by value since that's the only one that's populated. Actually, you know what? We do populate the text filter, so we'll use that instead. Right here, props.filters is the filters object, and we're going to access text, which we store on there. And if I save expense list, we're now going to get access to that information too. So as the store changes, this is automatically going to rerun, getting the fresh values in the component. So if we were to do something like set up a set timeout call and call this again, we could watch the data change. Right here, let's do that real quick. Set timeout. This lets us pass in 2 arguments. The first is a function, and the second is the amount of time you want to wait. So I'm going to go ahead and wait 3 seconds or 3,000 milliseconds. And after 3 seconds, when this function runs, all I'm going to do is call this again. I can copy the line and paste it down below. And then I'm just going to change it from water to anything else. Let's go ahead and use rent. So what's the end result? The end result is that we should see water showing to the screen for about 3 seconds. Then we should see rent. If we save the file, it's exactly what we're going to get. We have water, 1, 2, 3. We have rent, and this is where we stay for the rest of the time because the text filter doesn't change again. So it's important to note that when you connect a component to the Redux store, it's reactive, which means that as the store changes, your component is going to get re-rendered with those new values. This is fantastic because it allows us to create very simple components. This component doesn't need to worry about using store.subscribe or store.getState. It doesn't have to use any component state to manage that data. Instead, all of that is done for us by React Redux. All we have to do is define how we want to render things. So this is a very simple presentational component, and the goal is to get as many of our components into the presentational component pattern as possible. So that is it for this video. There is a ton left to cover, and I don't expect this to be clear by now. We're going to be going through it quite a few times. It is a very difficult topic to grasp at first. So let's take a quick moment to recap, then we'll dive into the next video and continue building out the app. In this video, we did 2 important things. First up, we set up provider inside of the root of our application. This let us define the store that we want to provide to all of our components. This is step one. We're not going to be changing this code. This is basically what it's going to look like for the rest of the course. Step two is the much more interesting step, where we create new higher order components using the connect function provided from React Redux. We call connect, we define the things that we want to get off of the store, and we define the component that we want to create the connected version of. The end result is a brand new component, which is just our component with the props from the store. This is going to allow us to create simple components and scale our application without worrying about putting all the glue into our code. As we can see, expense list didn't need anything passed down. All we did was we rendered it as is. All that information was provided to us via Connect. That is it for this video. We're going to continue on in the next one, so stay tuned and I'll see you then.